Hi everybody, it's Gerard OD here from Dynamis, and today I want to help you with a couple of the key questions that you have around physical intervention and restraint, or what we call in the care of older people, safe holding. So quick introduction to me and what I do. For about 10 years now, I've been traveling around the whole of the UK and a little bit internationally to help teams in health and social care and in education to work with vulnerable people who might display anger, aggression, distress, or even violence, either during what we might call a proper violent incident where they're becoming very aggressive, frustrated with staff because of something that's upset them, or through clinical situations where the staff are trying to get somebody clean and that person's resisting their efforts to get them clean and so on. I hold relevant qualifications in this sector which are current and which display my competency in important places like courtrooms and so on to talk about this sector and to give advice. Chiefly, I think the current questions that you have are around whether it's okay to physically restrain or intervene and hold an older person in care, and what some of the legal, moral or ethical reasons why that might be okay are. And then what are the practical kind of things that you need to know as management or senior management or even a team leader or supervisor if that sort of activity is happening in your service. So those really are these three key questions that are coming up on screen. Is safe holding somehow prohibited or against the law? Is there any regulations or guidance that can help us? And simply, is there anything else that I need to know about restraint in older people's services? Now, the first thing I want to talk about, that because it's so relevant, is the fact that about 21% of all the reported workplace injuries are physical assault in the social care sector. Lifting and handling, as you guys know, slips, trips and falls, and lifting and handling, we do lots of training on that, and we are constantly looking at how to do handling better and how to do lifting better. And we've got people watching our floors and so on. We've got yellow signs everywhere. However, really, physical assault is just as big a problem. It's only 6% behind those two leading causes of workplace injuries. And the question for you really is, are we doing enough? Are we doing as much as we need to in regards to our statutory responsibilities? It's a problem we can't ignore, because any situation, any case that comes up in a court in regards to negligence or breach of duty of care or anything will immediately pop up the fact that this is a major risk hazard in the workplace in social care. Here's one last statistic for you. It's the percentage of workplaces in the health and social care sector with 5 or more employees, and they're reporting the presence of various workplace risks. This is 2014, and the huge dark blue chunk at the top of the screen there, what you can see is 83% of these workplaces report what they're calling difficult customers, etc. Right after that, 59% of them are reporting lifting/handling issues. And really what I'm talking about today is where those two risks converge. They're the top two risks reported, and where we're having to, let's say, clean somebody in a bed who's resisting, then we've got both of those risks combining. So you guessed it, we're going to talk a little bit about health and safety here for a few minutes. What I want to make sure you're aware of are the different parts of health and safety that impact when we talk about dealing with violence, or what we might call distressed behaviors, which potentially could cause harm to staff or others. Under Section 2, you'll know that the employer, and that often boils down to the care home manager, has a duty to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, that persons in his employment, that's your staff, are not exposed to risks to their health and safety to the extent that they could be harmed. Section 3 is the duty that the employer has, and which extends to non-employees. So that's all of your service users in your services and the visitors and so on, that they not be exposed to risks to their being injured or harmed. And then Section 7 is the individual duty of employees to ensure that they are not that they are taking reasonable care for themselves and for others through their acts or omissions. I'll come back to the Section 7 duty of care in a minute. How we're all supposed to be doing this is through our risk assessments. And the risk assessments under Regulation 3 have to be suitable and they have to be sufficient, such that they control the risks to the health and safety of the staff first, and then the health and safety of the service users. And this is a very important distinction. In black and white, in that piece of legislation, it says you have to be assessing the risks to staff prior to assessing the risks to others. And the order of those two things is very important in many respects. And we've actually seen case law for care homes dealing with the risk of violence from older people who have attempted to say that the older person's needs took precedence in their care planning, and that they made the safety of staff and so on a secondary priority. And the judge slammed the care home in this sense, and he said, no, that's not how it must be. It must be that you're looking after staff primarily in the undertaking of your work. I'll briefly talk about the manual handling regulations. Again, when it comes to dealing with resistance from a distressed client who's sat down or in a bed, and we're asking the staff to carry out a care task with them, it can get very, very tricky from a manual handling perspective. You know, we take such care when it comes to hoists and transfer boards and so on like that, and assessing those risks and managing that equipment, that it would seem sensible then, wherever we have the risk of violence, not just a slip, trip or fall, but the risk that somebody will have their hair grabbed, or as we saw in Scotland and in a particular service not so long ago, somebody having their knee kicked out, somebody having their back injured or their neck injured or something like that, that we also have to take equal care really over the planning of such a handling operation. So in my experience, the manual handling trainers don't address violence, or they don't address it very thoroughly in their training sessions, chiefly because they're not trained to. And this then becomes another issue that we have to address when we train staff. Speaking of training, there are clear guidelines in the management regulations about when staff should get training. Essentially, anytime a risk comes into their working tasks, they need to be trained to deal with those risks. Anytime the risks change, and of course working with people with dementia, we know that over even short periods of time their behavior changes, their triggers, the things that set them off change, the way they cope with certain things changes, and so on. And there's also some information in there about how employees need to be refreshed on a regular basis in order to make sure that they can deal with the various risks that are being presented to them. So very clear instructions to management really about how to undertake training. I wanted to make sure that we really underline the fact that the health and safety executive deals with work-related violence as a legitimate health and safety issue when assessing compliance with health and safety law. So when a manager has an incident happen in their facility, perhaps and they have somebody go off sick or something like that, that could potentially show up as a breach of health and safety, which could bring a health and safety inspector to the service, and that has all sorts of implications. But you can, if you're reading ahead of me here, it says inspectors should check that where an employer's risk assessment identifies work-related violence as a hazard, requiring appropriate management and control, that such preventive controls have been implemented and that at-risk groups of employees have received appropriate training and information. And look at this, it says inspectors should normally concentrate on ensuring that employer has taken appropriate steps to minimize any risks to employees that might arise from the physical intervention. These steps will include ensuring that appropriate systems of work are in place, including appropriate policies and procedures. So as I go on through our presentation today for you, I want you to know that I've very recently, this week, reviewed all of the relevant guidance and legislation for Scotland which pertains to this area. On screen here you can see the Adult Services Regulation guidance from the Care Commission, as was, which says guidance on the regulation and the use of restraint for adult services. One of the really key documents in Scotland is the Mental Welfare Commission document guidance called Rights, Risks and Limits to Freedom. The first one of those came out about 2008, as I understand it, and I've been using extensively since then to explore and understand how physical intervention and safe holding is relevant in certain services, and how we can follow all of the right guidance and advice really from the Mental Welfare Commission. As I understand it, inspectorates in Scotland look to the Mental Welfare Commission guidance whenever they're inspecting a service. On screen also is the NHS Meeting Needs and Reducing Distress Guidance and the Mental Health Act Code of Practice. Well, the first thing is that all the guidance has to comply with law. The most important and key piece of legislation across the entire UK, which all Scottish legislation must also fall in line with, is the Human Rights Act 1998. There's lots to talk about the Human Rights Act. It's a presentation in itself. However, everybody has to understand this. Article 2, i.e. the first right granted under the Human Rights Act, is the right to life. Everyone's right to life shall be protected by law. That's what it says. And so everyone's right to life shall be protected by law means everyone. We have special groups, we have people with dementia, we've got people with learning disabilities and mental health, etc. But we also have staff who are being placed in vulnerable situations. And every person's right to life is protected by law. Very key. And every piece of legislation that follows has to comply with that. So life must be protected. In Scotland, you have the Adults with Incapacity Act. It sets out a system for safeguarding the welfare and managing the finances and property of adults who lack capacity. And it allows other people to make decisions on their behalf. It has a set of general principles that apply. And it talks about things like least restrictive intervention and the best interests or the benefit criteria as well, all of which is perfectly within the scope of what we're talking about. And physical restraint by itself, I could ask a question, can physically restraining a person benefit them? Well, I would argue that yes, if that person's going to physically hurt another human being, and that would potentially bring consequences, then when we stop that from happening, we are benefiting that person. And I want you to think about it that way. If we fail to stop that person from physically assaulting someone else and harming them, I can't see anybody being able to argue that would benefit the person. So it's a very important distinction about the benefit. What do we mean by benefit? Secondly, here we have the Mental Health Care and Treatment Act in 2003, and this gave us a set of principles which people would take into account when they're involved in somebody's care and treatment, and it talks about, again, interventions which are of the most benefit and which provide, if you like, powers to staff to take decisions which are in the person's best interests. And we'll look at those again a little bit later. So let me go back to Rights, Risks and Limits to Freedom, this Mental Welfare Commission guidance, which is really excellent. A definition that they use, they say that in its broadest sense, restraint is taking place when the planned or unplanned, conscious or unconscious actions of care staff prevent a resident or patient from doing what he or she wishes to do, and as a result that places limits on his or her freedom. Now, that's a great definition of restraint. It's one that staff wouldn't really be able to commit to memory. It's a great one to use when we're looking at a situation or whatever. However, the Royal College of Nursing guidance, which again came out around the same time, it's called Let's Talk About Restraint, and it's a much more conversational document while containing many of the essential points that we need to be aware of. And simply they said restraint's happening when we're stopping a person from doing something they appear to want to do. So both of these documents acknowledge that restraint is a thing and that it might be happening, without necessarily judging it as a negative or a positive thing. They simply put a name and a definition on it. The RCN guidance goes on to specifically define physical restraint as when one or more members of staff holds a person, moves them, or blocks their movement to stop them leaving a place. So that's physical restraint, and it goes on to discuss other types, but for now I'm going to limit my discussion today to physical restraint and safe holding. And throughout all of those documents, from the Mental Health Act Code of Practice all the way through to Let's Talk About Restraint and the NHS Managing Distress document, everybody acknowledges, as we have for many decades now really, that physical interventions and physical restraints, any kind of safe holding, has to be the absolute last resort in managing any kind of situation. And that is absolutely key. It's core to any good decision about using physical restraint or safe holding methods. And so here at Dynamis, we have an extensive program now called Verbal Defense and Influence, which addresses the entire spectrum of human conflict, and it deals with all of those pre-incident cues, all of the antecedents and triggers that might be causing stress to a person that would later on cause them to become distressed and to start presenting us with harmful behaviors. And you can see on screen there that part of the NHS's Managing Distress Guidance, this type of activity, this promoting positive behavior and looking at the environmental factors, the staffing factors, the medicinal factors and so on, which might be contributing to somebody's distress, all become hugely important if we're going to try and reduce our reliance on physical restraint or interventions. And that's totally accepted. However, I think everybody understands that no matter how well we're doing those things, we may still have to physically intervene and restrain. And so I want to draw your attention at a really key moment in my presentation to the Mental Welfare Commission Scotland guidance called Right to Treat. And there's a key paragraph in there where they say this: force may be necessary to provide basic care. For example, a person with dementia who develops incontinence may resist interventions to provide basic hygiene and skin care. Bathing and showering with the use of force or restraint may cause distress and may need to be less frequent than might be ideal. On the other hand, the person may suffer and be stigmatized because of poor hygiene. Caregivers must strike a balance and only use force where necessary and proportionate. Repeated use of force is likely to need formal legal authority. And just in that one paragraph on this one screen, I think we have the answer to the question about legally, morally, and ethically, is it going to be ever okay for us to use safe holding with an older person? And the answer is, and the legal answer is this: if it has become necessary, then we must. And how we do it is we must use a proportionate means. So let's go ahead and look at some other ideas around that just now. Even in the regulations, it hints at this idea of necessity. So we look at the care services regulations. It says the person providing the care service must ensure that no service user is subject to restraint unless it's the only practicable means of securing the welfare of that or any other service user, and that there are exceptional circumstances. And that, for me, when I read it with my understanding of this area, it screams about necessity. If we need to, if we must, if it's the only practicable means and there are exceptional circumstances, then that means we have to consider at least the physical restraint of a person. If we have necessity, then the question becomes, if we need to do something, how do we do it? And again, just looking at the guidance, we have lots of different ways that the how has been phrased. In the Adults with Incapacity Act, they talk about the least restrictive option. In SCISWI's guidance, issued in 2011, they talked about the least intrusive response. Consistent with the purpose of the intervention, considering the range of options available. So I've mixed phrases from the various pieces of guidance there, because they all say the same thing to me. And we go back to this word that was on the screen just a second ago, proportionate. If you need to use force, then the amount of force has to be proportionate. And there you have it. It's in the guidance. It's just worded in particular ways to suit, I think, particular sensibilities of the care sector. But essentially, you have these two really key questions. When is it going to be okay to use force? And the answer is, force is only used when it's necessary. As a last resort, when other viable options have been exhausted. And the second question, well then, if it's necessary, how much force do we use? Well, it's used in a proportionate way, which means that it's preventing a greater harm from occurring. And that's what we call reasonable force, the use of reasonable force in the circumstances. And so I wanted to talk now, just passing through that very quickly, but just to give you an idea, I wanted to talk about two different kinds of scenarios that you have and that you really should build into your policy. And that is, there are two kinds of restraint intervention or safe holding intervention. One of them is emergency. Now, looking through your policies and so on, I can see that you have what we call a safe holding policy for clinical reasons, where we have time and the resources to sit down, have a multidisciplinary meeting, and so on. And that's really the right-hand decision-making diagram here. But we also need to make, and I think it's very important, that we need to make provision for emergency uses of restraint as well, where we haven't foreseen this particular type of behavior come up, or it's the first time we're seeing it. It's a major surprise to everybody, but we have to make the situation safe. And that's a different type of situation. You see, in the emergency type of restraint, you don't have time to come up with a formally documented risk assessment, and you don't have time to look in the care plan or to check it or even to write one before you take action, because by its nature, an emergency restraint is unfolding very rapidly and it needs action right then and there. I'm going to go back to the RCN guidance for just a minute. The RCN guidance gives us 5 situations when adults who may be at risk can be justifiably restrained. And so they talk about when the service user is putting themselves at harm or putting somebody else at risk of harm, where there's a treatment required by a legal order, whether the person needs life-saving treatment or they need to be maintained in secure settings. And so they've opened up those 5 scenarios and said these are scenarios where staff may need to consider the restraint of an older person. And again, if we go back to the Care and Treatment Scotland Act, there is some really key principles there as well around using physical restraint. It says here, the treatment may be given notwithstanding that the patient doesn't consent or is incapable of consenting to the treatment. And the purposes could be to save the patient's life, to prevent serious deterioration in the patient's condition, to alleviate serious suffering, or to prevent the patient from 1, behaving violently, or 2, being a danger to themselves or to others. And really, again, when I talk about emergency versus planned restraint, I think that is really important when we look at what's going on in some of the services. So moving on from that, if we can accept now that in the guidance and in the various legal provisions, including the common law of Scotland, which gives any person the right to use force to prevent harm from occurring or to prevent a criminal offence from happening, we've got wide provisions within that to use force for the right reasons. Well, what I want to look at is the Code of Practice for the Care and Treatment Scotland Act here. And in section 87 it says, it's important to ensure that any intervention is undertaken only by staff who are fully trained in appropriate control, restraint and resuscitation techniques. And it would be best practice for managers to ensure that staff trained in these techniques are given regular opportunities to keep their skills current by taking refresher training from time to time. So now we're talking about once we've taken on the responsibility of being involved in these situations and that we understand that they may happen and that we have a duty of care to create safety from chaos. It's important then to realize that the staff need to be properly trained. Now on screen right now is one story provided by Unison of a court case that they prosecuted in the courts against a care home down in Buckinghamshire, where a 56-year-old woman was attacked by an elderly patient called Jack Tooby. She sustained very serious injuries in the attack, which left her unable to return to work, and she sued and won the case based on the fact that she'd spent 5 years in this care home. She'd had no training in dealing with violence or aggression. She was at the time working with Mr. Tooby, who had a history of violence, especially towards women. So we have a foreseeable risky situation developing, and ultimately he did attack her, and ultimately she couldn't call on any training or information or instructions that she'd been given, and so she won the case. It wasn't a huge payout, as you can see, and we have other cases here's one from Bradford in January 2013 of a young woman involved in a case where she was spat at in the eye by a service user, and the subsequent infection in her eye actually caused her to need to have a corneal transplant operation, which meant that she couldn't work. She was out of work for a long time. She had perhaps to contribute towards the operation and so on. But the situation was, of course, her union again, Unison, decided to take the case against the NHS Trust, and they won the case based on the fact that the Trust had failed to adequately risk assess the situation. The spitting was a known behaviour that the service user presented staff with when he became distressed. There was no adequate risk assessment, which would have talked about using goggles and so on when she's involved in this personal care task. And the interesting thing about this is, when I visited a care home in Scotland not so long ago, the staff basically said that they had, they had a service user who was exhibiting this type of behaviour, and that they'd asked for help and that they weren't receiving any. And so it can be easy to simply ask staff to get on with it. And unfortunately, when staff get injured, when they attempt to do that, it can often result in these negative consequences as we're looking at on screen here. That was an expensive case. It cost £110,000. So just to go back to it, I started this talk with regard to health and safety, and I'm finishing it here with regard to health and safety as well. Risk assessment is where we really need to be very, very strong, regardless of guidance, in fact, and regardless of regulatory inspection advice. The real key documents that you must lean on when it comes to controlling risks in your care home are the risk assessments. And we've had extensive conversations here with many, many leading figures really in risk management and violence management and so on. And the consensus here is this, that the risk assessment is the real pivot point for any decision that you make about how to control risks in your environment. And so training needs analysis will lead from risk assessments. On screen here you can see this is taken from the NHS. It says incident analysis will tell you what's going on. Risky behaviors and scenarios will tell you what's going on. The tasks and activities that your staff are performing, if they have risks in them, that will tell you what's going on. The expectations and so on, the level of knowledge and experience of your staff will all tell you what the learning gap is, and will help you to figure out what level of training the staff need. And so type of training the staff need will vary from one unit to another. They'll vary from one care home to another, and perhaps even with certain service users there will be specific training needs that pop out when you do a proper analysis of that individual. But on screen here is an NHS matrix that just describes different levels of training. Simple conflict management and understanding risks and responsibilities. Doing things like dynamic risk assessments and verbal communications, for example, somebody who is upset or angry but not yet violent. And it goes then increasingly into the more serious, more dynamic types of risk management that you have when you deal with violence. The middle one there is called breakaway and disengagement. How to get away from somebody who's trying to hurt you. But as it progresses to the right hand side, they start talking about restrictive skills, teamwork, emergency response, and so on like that. And so what we really need to do is decide what level of training is appropriate for the different staff teams, considering the different service users that they're dealing with. So I hope this talk has been useful to you. We've tried to answer the questions about, is holding an older person prohibited somehow or against the law somehow or morally or ethically wrong? And I think when looking at the guidance, and especially the health and safety aspects and the duty of care aspects, we can say that while it's a very difficult and very controversial subject, we can't simply look at the service users and say they're old, they are experiencing the distress of living in care and the distress of living with dementia, and look at that on its own. We also have to look at the health and well-being of our staff, both physically and mentally, and I think we have a moral, ethical duty to help them with that if they're going into risky situations. The law and the regulations and the national level guidance all talk about the need to use physical interventions as a last resort. And that's very much something, as I've said, that we believe in. But making it a last resort doesn't mean that it never happens. Making it a last resort means that despite our best efforts, sometimes it becomes necessary to use a physical safe hold with somebody in order to bring them that benefit of the care. And we have got lots of principles, as you've seen, to work with in regards to that. And finally then, are there things you need to know about restraint in older people's services? Well, absolutely, yes. I think as a manager in older people's services, it's absolutely critical, in fact, that you do your best to understand the violent incidents that are happening and to understand the various different responsibilities that you have in managing those scenarios. And to have this broad understanding of the problems of violence is really important if we're going to manage it adequately. So I hope this talk has helped you to understand a few things, at least from that perspective, that wider perspective. And it may have prompted you to ask a number of questions, in fact, about how we manage things. But I think that's good. So if we can promote discussion and raise awareness of the various issues, I think we'll be better able to manage these situations when they come up. Thanks for your time, and I hope to speak to you soon.